Hi, Boa. Welcome to 10 Minute Talks. I'm Harshadeva.
Today, I'm truly honored to welcome Dr. Cordula Reimann. She's a practitioner scholar, mediator, trainer, researcher, and dialogue facilitator with over 30 years of experience working across South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Throughout her remarkable journey, she has worked closely with grassroots movements, international organizations, governments, and civil society actors on conflict transformation, trauma, gender, and peace building. She has also served as a visiting lecturer and professor at institutions including ETH Zurich and University for Peace, contributing to the next generation of peace building scholars and practitioners. Today, her work focuses deeply on collective and transgenerational trauma, polarization, and inclusive crisis management. She's also one of the co-editors of the recently published The Routledge International Handbook on Trauma Responsive Peacebuilding.
Thank you very much, Cordula. Thank you very much for joining me today. My first question is you often highlight that trauma can actually shape and drive conflict, not just a result from it. Um, could you share a moment where overlooking trauma affected peace process or limited its success?
Yes, first of all, Harsha, thanks a lot for having me at your show. It's a great honor to be with you and all your listeners. Well, you asked a really big question, huh? And maybe before I'm going to maybe give one or two examples where maybe trauma was maybe overlooked. Maybe I can say a few words about how trauma maybe risk while neglecting trauma actually risk failure in peace processes, if we want to see it like that. And I think that's mainly maybe for a couple of reasons, and if you allow me maybe to highlight three of them. I think first of all we have to understand that what we see in a peace process, we see communities, we see individuals, including, of course, the respective leaders who are very often traumatized because of the violence they experience, either firsthand or witnessing it. And I think what we very often see is that these communities, these individuals, continue to live with what I would call autonomous nervous system in a survival state. And that basically means, for example, that they are still in a state of hypervigilance. So that they are full of maybe mistrust, that they feel they cannot really control or control their own emotions. They cannot trust the respective other communities. And I think without this sort of healing, we see very often, I think in many, many societies, communities undergoing a peace process, that even just minor political disputes can very easily perceived as existential threats in a way, and they can very easily then lead to a rapid return to violence. So for me, this is one important factor, while actually neglecting trauma risk actually failure of a peace process. Another one is that we know enough from the trauma research that unresolved trauma can be and very often is passed down to children. So, in other words, from one generation to the next. And how is that happening? That's very often happening through socialization, through parenting styles, and cultural narratives. And that basically also means that we often in the sort of peace process, we can see that a new generation is maybe socialized that inherits in a way the grievances of their parents. And by that, also the conflict dynamics are basically kept alive. So when we think of, for instance, the parenting styles of maybe parents who have just come out of maybe war or genocide, what we might see is that the parents are very, very hyper vigilant, and they maybe have a really strong need to control. They have a really maybe hard time to trust anyone. And this is not surprising, knowing the impact of violence on communities and knowing the link between violence and trauma. And it might mean that many parents might actually, for instance, also then learn how to numb their feelings of, for instance, shame or guilt, for instance, with substance abuse. So that's another important, I would say, factor why it is important not only to talk about trauma, but why also neglecting trauma risks failure in a peace process. And then I think maybe another important factor is that trauma, especially collective trauma, we know often cements this us versus them thinking and narratives. And I would argue if these narratives and the emotions connected to that are not addressed, that it seems impossible to build the collective empathy, which is basically required for long-term coexistence in a society. And if you now were asking me for two concrete or two, three examples, of course, I'm commenting on these examples, from the outsider perspective, and there might be very different angles of what I'm now trying to argue. But if we took two examples, one which is a bit closer to home, and one is a bit further away. When you think of the, let's say, Northern Ireland, many of your listeners may remember the Good Friday Agreement from 98. And I think it was a very, very important, of course, agreement which brought the long awaited political peace, for most people anyway. But I think to my knowledge, they even studies as recently as, I think, 2021, 2025, who still highlight that the peace process actually failed to address the sort of troubles related, as the conflict dynamics were also called, trauma in the families, and still leading to lingering sectarian mental health issues, particularly in the younger generation, long born after the agreement. So I think that's maybe one example, and the other one might be from Bosnia. Again, your listeners may remember the Dayton Agreement of 95. And again, when we look a little bit what was the quality or the nature of this peace agreement, the Dayton Accords, well, I mean, first and foremost, it was basically ending a so-called inter-ethnic war by partitioning the country into different ethnic entities in a way. And I would say it was first and foremost a political deal, what we call the so-called track one kind of deal between different leaders. And I think looking at the research being done on Dayton, looking at the research from a trauma perspective, I think maybe many would agree that the whole process overlooked the deep, deep psychosocial trauma and interpersonal violence that basically destroyed the communities, which also destroyed the inter-ethnic cooperation and harmony which was there before the war. And I would say this sort of sheer lack of focus on these community reconciliation as part of the peace accord, I would say in many ways contributed to this highly divided society, where I would argue trauma remained an obstacle many, many years later, and I think to this day. For instance, I was in Bosnia 3 years ago, and there was a lot of talk about how the inter-ethnic violence is still, or tensions, maybe not so much violence, is in most parts of the country, but there was a lot of inter-ethnic tensions, and some people rightly so or not, maybe that's up for debate, we're still really worried about that this tensions might again translate into violence. So these are maybe two examples of peace processes where we could see how maybe trauma was neglected.
Thank you, Cordula. My second question is, so humanitarian workers on the ground in conflict or post-conflict settings, what is a meaningful shift they can make to be more trauma aware in their daily work?
Yeah, again, Hasha, thank you for this very, very important question. And I think it sounds like there's only one meaningful shift. And I don't know, I want to believe that there are many meaningful shifts, all of us working in the context of humanitarian aid, but maybe also beyond that. And I would like to include here the whole peace building field as well. So top of my head, maybe I can think of the following. And also think very self-critically about my own experience. Maybe the first one would be, Harsha, what I would call expectation management. I think what I learned also the hard way is that it's maybe good to assume that everyone you encounter in the context of humanitarian aid and the context of peace building, be it maybe the colleagues, maybe the community members, or be it the community leaders, that they all have experienced some form of individual or collective trauma. And for me, this is a big and, that many, many people are far more resilient than we actually think. So for me, the shift there could be or should be that, that we try to guide, support, lead with empathy and patience by default, so to say. And we really put, the empowerment and the agency of the people we serve, we want to work with first. That would be definitely for me a really important shift. Then I think another one would be maybe along the question of how we think of effectiveness, impact, efficiency in this day and age where we talk so much about impact assessment, for instance. And I personally would say that I would say we have to prioritize far more the agency and the safety over questions of efficiency and impact. I'm sure not all donors maybe listening are too happy to hear that. But at least from my perspective, this is very, very important if we take trauma seriously. And that means on a really small scale that we talk more in terms of choices. And that could be even small choices, which maybe even, seem trivial to some of us, but give people choices to say, when we work with them, is it now a good time to talk to you? Or would you need to come back in a day or two? That could mean for people a greater kind of maybe influence over their own life. And it may help, even if this is such a maybe seemingly trivial kind of question, but it may help to restore a sense of power where people very often feel really powerlessness. Another important thing might be that, again, I learned the hard way that that transparency or predictability is actually, in my humble reading, a safety tool. So what do I mean by that is very often in the context of humanitarian aid and peace building, the world is very chaotic, seems and is very, very dangerous. And of course, chaos triggers the nervous system into this sort of fight, flight, freeze response. And I think the shift there could be to be radically transparent and explain exactly what you're going to do and why. And if a meeting is going longer, then explain why. And if you need to take notes, explain why you're doing that and what happens actually with the notes, who's going to read it, and so on. And I think consistency and transparency, I think we talk a lot about, especially in the sort of project management world, but how often are we actually living up to that? Maybe that's another question. Then another important area is this whole question of how we who want to work in this field, who or have been working in this field of humanitarian aid and peace building, how we maybe practice self-reflexivity and cultural humility. That for me implies to also rethink our own roles, huh? Including big questions like why on earth are we doing the work we are doing? Huh? And to really allow ourselves to be really open-minded when we arrive at certain places and working with people. I think how often, for instance, me self-critically reflecting on my past experience, how often did I arrive with actually already having a fixed idea, a solution, what to do? And really change that and say, to really deeply listening, to deeply listening also, of course, to what is needed implies this really great open mindset on this great flexibility. And of course, also this understanding of really a shared ownership, which for me also implies a shared decision making. And I think it also maybe reduces this quote unquote savior dynamic, which we still so often see or have seen far too often in our field. And I think it also fosters true resilience. And maybe a last one, which so often we talk about, namely that I think another shift which is maybe necessary in our field is to view basically self-care and what we talk about, these duty of care policies, structures, not as a luxury or nice to have or add on, but a question for me of professionalism, a question of professional competency. And for instance, when I think of my own, again, experience, I never was, taught in any kind of course or class, I'm not even mentioning university, how to regulate your own or my nervous system. And I think for me, this is really, really important, this ability to learn how to self-regulate. And we know that only if we are looking after ourselves, if we are connected, if we are feeling safe, we can also be of service to others. So these are some of my maybe thoughts on this. Again, Harsha, another really big and important question.
Cordula, my last question is, even in difficult context, you seem to hold on a strong sense of optimism. Hmm. Where does that come from? And how does it guide your engagement with trauma and peace building?
Well, I mean, yeah, some friends might say I'm a diehard optimist, and of course, this is not always the case. I'm like other human beings. I have moments where I feel really low and where I struggle to see, the light at the end of the tunnel, especially in this day and age. But I think by and large, I think I try to be a diehard optimist. And I think if I have to think of the glasses half full or half empty, for me, it is always half full. And I cannot even help myself, because this is very much my way of thinking, has always been, and hopefully it will always stay like that. And for me, Harsha, it doesn't mean to sugarcoat, harsh reality, because I think we're living in really difficult, challenging time. But for me, it's a way of looking at the world from a very, you can say, life affirming, human loving kind of approach. Because I think I'm still in awe what many humans around the world do for each other every day. It's not making the headlines, the big headlines anyway, but I think this is what I think choose to focus on. And if you had to ask me, or if you, as you asked me, where does it actually come from? Well, without doing maybe too much of a psychoanalyst with myself, I would say it may, who knows, may have something to do with the fact that I had a traumatic past in the sense of that I had cancer when I was a child and as a teenager. And for me, life is precious and every day is precious. And I really try to embrace every day. Yeah. And try to really enjoy life to the fullest. And I think that makes me also very aware how fragile life can be. And I know how important it is, what kind of thoughts we're having, how important it is to look after yourself. And I also learned that humor, for instance, is a really great resource. And for me, humor is, for me, an untapped resource, I would say, in peace building. And we should, I think, despite all the challenges we are facing, especially in this day and age of genocide and war, I think we should again maybe all learn how to be able to tap into this resource of humor, even in difficult times. And another thing which maybe helped me, that I try to be radically honest in a way with myself about my weaknesses and my strengths, and to also acknowledge certain things I try to do, yes, with maybe good intention, and it may still have not the intended effect. And to also embrace that and acknowledge that, and not wish for myself to be someone else, but to really accept this is who I am. This is what I'm trying to do, with my limited resources. And I think, how does it engage was your question, huh? How I engage, or how does that guide me, how I engage with trauma and peace building. And I would say that I try to have this step-by-step approach, this one step, the others, that small steps do matter, even if they're not making the headlines, or if they are not, maybe, if you cannot put them into indicators. I have to say, I was never a person who was in any way obsessed with high-level change. And I know this is a big topic in the peace building field. Can we reach the key people? Can we reach the sort of policymakers? And I think it's nice if we do that. And I think we have to be strategic in peace building. No question about it. But me, as a person, I think I'm more interested in this human to human kind of impacts along the lines of, when people say, I attended maybe a workshop you facilitated, and after that, I look at the world from a different angle. For me, this is one of the most beautiful moments in my life. And I really don't exaggerate when I say that. So for me, this is my approach also to trauma and peace building, that if I feel we can see this small level change, that people understand, I'm actually like that. I'm maybe hyper vigilant or aggressive because I now understand how trauma impacted my life and how it impacted my family. And I can understand how trauma is playing out in our communities. I can now understand why we have the worldviews. Like, for instance, the world is a dark place out there and you should never trust anyone. I now understand where that is coming from. if I can somehow be part of that kind of process, for me, this is a gift, and it's also a privilege, of course. And I think that is a little bit what is guiding my work in terms of trauma and peace building, to really look at the small level change. And I think in all of that, details do matter. I also believe that individuals can make a big difference. And I always believed in the differences in individuals and collectives can make. I believe in individual and collective resilience. And maybe, Harsha, I also always believed in the fact that, or for me it's a fact, maybe your listeners beg to differ, that I believe that people know what is good for them. And they don't need other people telling them, you should do ABC. People, if we give them the space and the time, I think they know what is good for them. And I think we, maybe as outsiders, what we can do or should do is deeply listen, and if wanted, we can offer maybe an interesting perspective and try to understand. But I think this listening and deeply listening, so with the intention of understanding, not with the intention of replying, definitely a really important skill, which I think we have to harvest time and again.
Thank you very much, Cordula. Thank you very much for this insightful conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Harsha, for having me.